In 2006, the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command produced a classified wargame simulation called The Day After. In this wargame, also known as Capstone 1, the United States would be at war with an unnamed nation that could very well be Russia. According to the report, within just 1 day of conflict, major cities were under attack. Key infrastructure was destroyed, and there was no hope of winning. This video is based on the wargame simulation and explores what a modern U.S. war may look like. Let's jump in. On June 2, 2006, the U.S. Army conducted a wargame simulation where they attempted to answer the question, what if we go to war with Russia? The simulation took place over 3 days, but for the sake of this video, we will only cover the first day, because it paints a grim picture for the United States. It's important to note that this simulation took place before Russia reformed its military doctrine and began to modernize its military capabilities. So, the result of today's wargame might paint an even grimmer picture for the United States. The main purpose of this exercise was to determine the defense strategy the United States should take against the Russian military. This exercise also tested how prepared or unprepared the U.S. was for such a conflict. Before the start of the exercise, senior officers in the U.S. Army believed that the first 72 hours of a large-scale war with Russia would be dominated by air warfare, meaning it would be all about the U.S.'s Air Force and Russia's air defense systems. However, after the first day of the exercise, many of the generals had a complete paradigm shift in their thinking. They now realized that a ground war was inevitable, and unfortunately, things didn't look too good for the U.S. military. To win a war, you must have a strong economy to back it up. If we look at the economic strength of the U.S. versus Russia, it becomes clear that Russia actually has the advantage here. If we look at the PPP GDP per capita, stands for Purchasing Power Parity Gross Domestic Product per capita, the U.S. comes in at $59,000, while Russia comes in at $25,000. This means that on average, Russians can buy more with their money than Americans can. It also means that the Russian government can use more of its tax revenue to support its military. To make matters worse for the United States, Russia spends 6.4% of its GDP on its military, while the United States only spends 3.1% of its GDP on its military. Even though the United States spends more money on its military than any other country, when you compare it to Russia, it doesn't look so hot anymore. Let's see how these economic factors played out during the wargame simulation. At 8 a.m. on day 1, the Russian military launched a surprise attack on Poland and the Baltic states. At the same time, Russian airborne forces seized key bridges and roads leading into these countries. By 10 a.m., NATO air defenses were already being overwhelmed. 1 hour later, at 11 a.m., Russian bombers and fighter jets began to destroy key targets throughout Poland. For the next 2 hours, the Polish Air Force attempted to defend their airspace, but they were severely outnumbered and outgunned. At 1 p.m., Warsaw was effectively neutralized. While this was happening, Russian missiles were flying through the skies towards the United States. During the simulation, it was estimated that between 200 to 500 ballistic missiles were fired at the United States. Many of these missiles contained biological and chemical weapons. These weapons caused widespread destruction and casualties throughout the northeastern United States. Within just 2 hours of impact, major cities like New York and Boston had been completely neutralized. With key cities like this being taken out of the fight so quickly, the U.S. military found itself in an impossible situation. 5 p.m., the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff met with the President to discuss their options. They had 3: negotiate peace with Russia, declare war on Russia, or do nothing. The war game simulation showed that all 3 options had severe consequences. If the U.S. did nothing, then Russia would continue to pound them with missiles and eventually invade Alaska. If they negotiated with Russia, it would show weakness and would likely lead to more aggressive actions from Russia. And finally, if they declared war, they had to know that they would not be able to win. Doing so would only escalate the conflict and lead to the total destruction of the planet. But why was it impossible for the United States to win this war? As mentioned earlier in the video, the U.S. military thought that the war would be won in the air. But after just 1 day of fighting, they realized that they couldn't compete with Russia in a war of attrition. For example, the U.S. believed that it could take out Russia's nuclear arsenal in the first few days of the war. This wouldn't be difficult considering that Russia only has 1629 nuclear warheads. All the U.S. had to do was hit each warhead with a missile. But as the war game simulation showed, Russia was always 1 step ahead of them. Russia had decoy sites that were designed to trick the U.S. military into attacking the wrong target. And to make things worse, Russia had created false intelligence that led the U.S. military to believe that they were behind in the war. This wasn't intelligence that Russia created to fool the U.S. military. Instead, it was real intelligence that Russia gathered on the U.S. military. Russia knew that the U.S. was vulnerable in the Northeast, so they decided to focus on taking out the major cities in this area. This further convinced the U.S. military that they were behind in the war. At 6 p.m., the U.S. Air Force had lost 96 aircraft while only managing to destroy 20 Russian aircraft. With the U.S. losing the war in the air, the simulation showed that there was nothing left to do but watch as Russia invaded Alaska. Throughout the rest of the night, Russian troops seized key points throughout Alaska. By 8 a.m. the next morning, it was all over. Russia had successfully invaded the United States, and there was nothing left for the U.S. military to do but surrender. With this bleak outlook for the United States, it makes you wonder if this scenario is possible in real life. While some aspects of the simulation are far-fetched, such as Russia invading Alaska, it does paint a grim picture of what a potential conflict between Russia and the United States could look like. For example, Russia's ability to strike deep into U.S. territory with long-range missiles is a very real threat, and the U.S. military has acknowledged that they could potentially be overwhelmed in a large-scale conflict with Russia. In fact, Russia's recent military exercises in the Arctic region highlight the growing Russian threat in the area. These exercises involve simulating an invasion of a country in the Arctic region, which is a clear sign of Russia's aggressive intentions in the region. Despite this grim outlook, it's important to remember that war is never inevitable. There are always diplomatic solutions that can be reached between nations. But if diplomacy fails, then it's important to know your enemy's strengths and weaknesses. And right now, Russia seems to have the upper hand in a potential conflict with the United States. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one next. Why don't we hear more about Russia's victory in World War II? And how does it affect their view of the world today? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.